Okay, I'm going to start now on the basis that I'll keep an eye on the waiting room and let people in as we go forward, just so we try and get finish at a reasonable time in case there's a lot of questions. So basically, this is adding photo ID to your diving tool set. So it's one of a series of talks that Sea Search Ireland are hosting during the lockdown. We kind of hope people get a lot out of them. You can find more information on the planned talks on our website, seasearchireland.ie, and we're also promoting them on Facebook and via our mailing list. I'm very excited about this talk because we've got some really superb people presenting. And before we start, I'd like to express my thanks to them for agreeing to take part in this and spending their time developing it. So this workshop is meant to be a guide to using your camera skills to record marine biodiversity. So to introduce you to the key points you need to consider while taking photographs to identify species, introduce you to various aspects of marine life that you need to think about when you're taking photographs, and then hopefully add more purpose to your dives and snorkels and the photographs you take. For reference purposes, I should also let you know that the talk will be recorded and will be available later. So we have some extremely knowledgeable people here, John, Maja, and Joe and Martin, to take you through the details of photo ID. We will be taking questions in the chat box and we'll look to deal with them all towards the end. So basically, I'm starting off right now. We're going, okay, why document marine ID? So I'm working with Sea Search Ireland, which was set up in the UK in the late 1990s, early 2000s, under the auspices of the Marine Conservation Society. And the primary aims are to gather information on seabed habitats and marine life around the coastline of Britain and Ireland. To provide training then in recording skills for volunteers, to make sure that the data coming out of this recording is quality, so that it is verified before it goes in, and then also trying to make sure this data is as freely available as possible. But also, I feel like a sub-goal to fill in as many gaps in knowledge and record changes in the marine habitat and species as we go on. So in the UK, their primary goal has been to help develop a framework for management decisions and conservation activities to protect and enhance the marine environment. That hasn't been as relevant in Ireland up to now. But if you look at the marine environment, there's obviously a tremendous amount of pressure in there coming from a number of different areas, like overfishing, bycatch, the damage being done by fishing gear, pollution, invasive species, litter, power generation, climate change, and you could probably keep on going at that list for a long time. So we are all aware of the fact that the marine environment is under a lot of pressure. But for us, what we need to do is we need to look at things like changes. So for instance, look at the introduction of non-native or invasive species like slipper limpets or the sargassum. And also quite relevant at the moment is Ondaria wakami, which we know is in Ireland and we know is along the east coast and possibly further. And we are actually promoting or asking people to check local marinas and harbours for this at the moment. So we have species, or we have samples from Carlingford, we have it ID'd in Greystones and Dunleary, and we're basically approaching people to look at that. So that's one of the, if you like, key points. It's, we know it's there, it's under recorded, but we need to record it. And for good recording, you need good photographs. What I was saying earlier is that in the UK, they have been managing their marine environment for a number of years. Over here, we haven't had MPAs. There hasn't been legislation there that gives you protection, that properly protects areas. And at the moment, the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage is in the middle of a consultancy process on the expansion of MPAs. And they have a lot of criteria they're going to use for evaluating areas for MPAs. The key ones I pulled out were threatened species or habitats, important species or habitats, representative features areas of high biodiversity, areas contributing to the maintenance of ecosystems, and then specific habitats like eelgrass, reforming species like Dersopella, marl, and there's other ones in there as well. But for us to do anything, we need to have the baseline data. So it's very important for us to have records. So if we look at where sea search is coming from, we've been recording since 2000 in Ireland since 2003, and up to now we've got about 600,000 records, and they are the vast majority of the inshore subtidal records for recent years. So we have records from 1,200 sites, 1,250 species, and we've done specific surveys in Belmullet, Kenmare, Lough, and you can find a lot of that data by looking at the biodiversity website. So sea search, we have different levels of recording effort. So the base introduction is a Sea Search Observer, which is a one-day course with recording soon afterwards, and it's relatively straightforward. Most people are able to pick it up fairly quickly. When people are become experienced Sea Search observers, then the next step on would be Sea Search Surveyor. Surveyor is a 2-day course. It's much more intensive, and I think it's tremendous amount of fun. I really enjoyed it, but it requires a lot more time and effort to do the recording. There are obviously specialized sea search research projects where we're looking at specific species and specific IDs, and they tend to be run on request. We tend to do those as specifics. In Ireland, we have an adopt a site scheme going, which is based around 100 species, and it's primarily an effort-based recording system where we're basically saying dive the same sites, record how many people are diving, how long you did, and try and get as many species as possible. There's an ID and techniques course, and we run that on request for people. In terms of records, for submitting records, the observer, there's a paper form and there's a PDF, which is quite useful. The same is true for the surveyor form. The adopt a site is paper and Excel. And then Biodiversity Ireland does have a marine recording section, which I think is getting changed reasonably regularly, because I think they're heading for requiring photographs for all IDs at this stage. If you've got any questions on, if you like recording or want to get more involved with us, send us an email at seasearchireland@gmail.com or talk to us via our Facebook page. So having said effectively all of that, if you're getting into sea search or getting into photo ID, I think the most important thing to remember is that because you're doing this, it doesn't mean that you can ignore normal diving safety. So you need to take account of your normal things. So for instance, you need to be checking your body, your time, your air, your buoyancy, your trim, your personal comfort, and watching your position, all that kind of stuff. Correct weighting is a huge part of it. I freely would admit that often when I know I'm taking photographs in certain areas, I'll overweight on the basis that it's easier for me to take photographs. And that's probably a bad thing to do. You really need to manage your weight and your buoyancy and your trim, so you're not interfering with anything else. This one caused a couple of giggles when we were talking about it before the session, which is that for photo ID, we're saying you need to minimize your impact on marine life. You shouldn't be chasing stuff to get photographs of it. You shouldn't be feeding it to get photographs of it. You shouldn't be posing it to get nice photographs. And you shouldn't be strobing something to death by flashing the strobe into somebody's eyes hundreds of times. So the key here is really only take a reasonable number of photographs of things. And I get into this. This is one of the ones I found interesting. The map here is of the recorded species records for a particular species. And the reason I find that interesting is that red blennies, we were regularly being spotted on dives. there was an initial refusal to accept their presence in Irish waters, and they were only confirmed after specimens were returned. So if you look at that, like, there's probably a reason. If I look at this photograph, this is, I'm going to say, quite a good photograph of a red blenny sitting in the back of a crevice, which is where they're normally going to be. If I expand that a little bit more, I can see I've got the blue dot on the fin, which is quite diagnostic for breeding males. But if I refer to Lynn's photograph, which I think I got permission for Lynn, is she said, basically saying you need to look at the tentacles. They're flatter than tompots, and they extend over the eyes, and then you need to be looking at the mouth. And the reason for showing this is to say, trying to get a picture of the dorsal fin and saying I've got it or not got it doesn't really cut it if you want to do proper ID. You need to get the right photograph to be able to do photo ID. Looking at what species you're going to be photographing, you need to think about the environmental factors that are going to affect them. If you're looking at a dive, if you look at shallow areas, you're going to get lots of light. You're going to get green algae. Further down, you're going to get brown. Further down, you're going to get red. And at the bottom, you're only going to get animals effectively. So when you're thinking about what photographs the species you're taking photographs of, you need to be aware of that transient and what's likely to happen. The next thing you need to be aware of is the underwater landscapes. Like the primary ones that underwater landscapes are categorized in at a rough level is rocky reefs. And I think we all know what a rocky reef looks like. Boulders, large, bigger than your head. Cobbles and pebbles would be another categorization. Mud. And then the last one that in terms of categorizations would be artificial substrates, or any wreckage or anything like that. So if you're taking a photograph of a species, you need to be thinking about what habitat am I taking a photograph of the species in, because that will be a huge clue into what your species is likely to be. That particular creatures live in certain areas. If you look at then species groupings, I find this quite humorous to an extent. Is when I started diving and I started thinking about ID, I thought about fish. Fish is what I was like. I thought I was going to be straightforward, but you've got fish, crustaceans, and which is the crabs, lobsters, prawns, barnacles, all that kind of stuff. Cnidarians, the anemones, which include corals, and hydroid, and jellyfish. You've got the mollusks, which are snails, sea slugs, bivalves, include things like octopus and cowries. You've got the echinoderms, starfish, brittle stars, sponges, sea squirts, flatworms, segmented worms, and bryozoans. And one of the biggest problem areas at times is trying to figure out the thing I'm looking at, which group does it belong to? And that can be very, it can make it quite difficult at times to figure out what aspects of the species do you need to take photographs of. I find that even, I feel like seaweeds, you've got green, brown, red. Just the fact that the colors are not always diagnostic of which grouping they're actually in. So looking at your species groups will help you decide which type of photograph you need to be getting to be able to look at things. So having gone through all of that, I'm now going to pass on to what I would consider would be the expert. So basically now we're going to hand on to John, who's going to start talking to us about IDing fish. Sorry, before I finish, I'd like to also add that we are looking for support for Sea Search Ireland for a GoFundMe page where we're trying to get some GoPros to monitor some of the sapella reefs. So if you enjoy the talk, I would appreciate if you could go to GoFundMe.com and contribute to Sea Search Ireland. So next up is John, please.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about fishes. You can ask me afterwards the difference between fish and fishes. But anyway, what you need, I'm saying you need a camera and lighting. You need a compatible dive buddy, and in discussion, I think that's probably the most important one. Ideally, the compatible dive buddy is probably with a camera as well and isn't racing away from you. And I have found that you can do best on long, slow, unrushed dives. I'm just taking you briefly, Martin will take you through the photography section properly. I'm just telling you that I'm using, it's about a 5-year-old Olympus TG4. I use it in the housing. It can be used, it's a compact camera which can be used to 15 meters without housing, but I find I can't find the buttons with my fingers without the housing, so I don't use it other than in the housing. I usually use the macro settings and the fish settings, and I use the internal flash is usually switched on, and I have a video torch which the details are there. It's a fairly bright one, but again, it's 4 or 5 years old, so there's probably better available now. The book that I find I use mostly is The Marine Fishes of Wales, and the reference is given on the bottom of the page. Basically, fishes fall into 2 groups: the cartilaginous fishes, which include the dogfish, sharks, skates, and rays. And I've just put in one picture here and a picture of an electric ray, which was taken in at Brandon in Coos in County Kerry. And it was taken in apparently about 2 meters of water. Oh, that's an electric ray, and I'm not really talking about the cartilaginous fish. I do say that I would usually call the first photograph I showed you a dogfish, but you'll find it in the book, and some people that we know that Tony calls them cat sharks, and I still call them dogfish. So most of the fishes are bony fishes. That means they've got true bone and their gills are under a gill cover, and the word for that is an operculum. There are some diagrams here. Basically, you can get to know the names of the fins if you're reading this book. You know that you'll learn that there's a lateral line, which I'm drawing the mouse along now, and lateral line. And this is a series of receptors that balance the fish in the water. You should be noticing whether there's one dorsal fin, or in the cod family, the dorsal fin is in 3 parts. Notice the position of the fins. So the pectoral fin is here and the pelvic fin is here in the more primitive fish. And then the pectoral fin moves forward and goes up. And then the pelvic fin moves forward so you get the 2 fins here in what are considered to be the more advanced fishes. Anyway, you'll get to know that. The other thing that we'll be noticing about is a barbel. So ideally during a dive, you're trying to note the approximate size. I hold up my hand. Is it the hand length, elbow length, arm length? Any obvious black or colored spots? The lateral line, is it straight or is it bent? You should be able to see it on many fish. And then noting the things about the fins. So if you see 3 dorsal fin, you can say that it's in the cod family immediately. And does it have a barbel? This is the little thing under its front jaw. And so here is a pouting taken in Newquay, and basically you can see the 3 parts of the fin. You can see the lateral line. You can see the position of the fins. So there's one here and there's one here, and it has a barbel. So it has all of those things that we've been talking about. So during a dive, you're trying to see all of these items, and we'll just show part of this video and move on. But this was on a day when, in fact, most of the dirt that's being stored up is being stored up by the fishes themselves. So I suggest that that you tackle the fishes group by group, and I always think that the easiest group to start with are the wrasses. There are 5 species, and one has different males and females, and all of us divers will know some of them at least. So the cuckoo wrasse, the male is very obvious. Many people don't seem to realize that the females are these more drab-colored, pinkish brown color is the female, and she has these black and white marks along the top. What everybody doesn't realize about is that all of the wrasses are born as females, and then they become males as necessary. So this is a female that's on her way to becoming a male because of the blue parts. And sometimes during a dive, you'll see lots of these males appearing. And there's a series of them. Some summers there are more than others. And this is a sort of a widespread thing in the wrasse family. So if you want to Google a bit more about the information on that, Google sex changes in cuckoo wrasse. And basically, if the male dies, another becomes a male. Another female becomes a male. Okay, so then the next one that I'll mention is the rock cook. And some people have come back into the boat after a dive and said, I saw these little small cuckoo wrasses. And when you quiz them further, the size is about the size of their hand. So their goldfish size or smaller. And then they have these blue marks and things. So they do look like a little miniature, but they are miniature. They're a different species. They're rock cooks. And they've got these bands on the tail as well. And you'll notice that they have one big long fin, dorsal fin. And that's another picture of a rock cook showing. So when you don't have my hand to tell you that it's smaller than my hand, then you might be wondering, what is it? But it's a rock cook. The goldsinny wrasse is quite goldy colored when you get it in good light with a torch on it. And it has a spot at the top of the tail, at the top of the base of the tail. And the corkwing wrasse quite often, doesn't always, but quite often has a spot in the middle of the tail. And this one is found very much in where there's a lot of seaweed. And basically all of the other big, what I would call slobs of fish that you see on a dive are of the wrasses, are the ballan wrasses. So this is a series of them because they come with a various sequence of different colors. And there's one other wrasse that we're supposed to be looking out for. I still haven't convinced myself that I've seen it, and I definitely don't have my own pictures. But is the Ballan's wrasse, and it's pinkish with pinkish fins in the breeding season. And there's also this dark blue arc. So I think photographs would be quite necessary for that one to convince people that you've seen it. Now, if we move towards flatfish, they are right-handed and they're left-handed. The way I usually explain this is that all of the flatfish start off as normal sort of fish, and then eventually they migrate to lie on the bottom. And if you've got two sides, some of the species land on their, this is me looking at my hand at the moment, they land on their left-hand side and the upper side is the right-hand side. And then the left-hand ones are the other way around. So plaice is a right-handed fish, flounder, lemon sole. They're the three that we'll probably see on dives. And then top knots are the common one on of the left-hand fish. I also say that if you have a good fishmongers, you should just go and look at them on the slab and see what they look like and convince yourself about left-handed and right-handed. So this is a right-handed fish. If you have to imagine this holding up your hand at the right-hand side, but this is the gill cover, the mouth. So that is a right-handed fish, and then the red spots gives it away. But this one is also a right-handed fish, and it's probably a lemon sole. And then this is a left-handed fish because the gill cover is down here, and here's the mouth. And the other thing is that the photograph allows you to see that the parts of the dorsal fin come right around and almost reach the mouth. So that means it's the ordinary common top knot. This fish has been in one spot in Newquay in County Clare for a couple of years now and comes out to pose regularly. Some days doesn't pose, other days does. So you can see where the gills are, where the fin rays of the dorsal fin is in relation to the mouth. And that's a full frame shot with the Olympus TG4 camera. Blennies and Gobies, basically Gobies have a dorsal fin split into two parts. Blennies have a single dorsal fin. I'll skip this slide since Tony has already shown it. And that one. And then these are some shots in the Kilkee area of red blenny. And this fellow was posing, and after 4 or 5 shots, I knew I had got this the nice blue shot, nice blue spot. And again, if they don't have the blue spot, you're looking at stripes on the eyes. But again, the book will give you the book that I refer to will give you the details of what you're looking for. This one is less red, but has the blue spot. I'm quite willing to discuss which species that is, but I presume it's the red blenny. And then gobies have the split between them. And when you're taking your photographs, you feel you're happy when you get these stripes, when you get black spots here, and when you can get the relative length of the fins. And usually, if you take 4 or 5 shots, these individuals, they pose for photographs. This one, I think Tony has photographed it regularly as well, was under one stone near the pier in Newquay for a long time, about 2 years ago now. And this is from Lochine, which is the red-mouthed goby, which is one of the gobies for Ireland that you get a little bit more excited about. A Mediterranean species that's found in the Lochine area. Sea scorpion fish, this is the short side spine sea scorpion because it doesn't have something, which I'll show you in a moment. This one has these little white, this is the long spine sea scorpion, and it has this little white, check the little spine, I think it's called, rather than a barbel, at the base of the mandible. And if I go back to the previous one, you'll see that it doesn't have it. And the spines along here on the operculum are much shorter. Whereas the spines here are more obvious. This is a place where the use of the camera was very useful. And I'd also say the use of the fact that it was a compact camera was very useful because for some time I was seeing a fish. And I had seen the similar fish in Kilkee in my early years of diving, but I didn't have a camera. and I was never able to go at identifying it. But basically, I'm trying to describe a fish that's about 30 centimeters, 30 centimeters long, deep, 2.5 meters in under a tight crevice. And this was the sort of thing one was getting at the extreme limits of the camera. And I took quite a few pictures over a few dives, and I'm showing you the best 4 or 5, but you can see a few things. One is that there are white spines here on the ventral fin, that there's a long dorsal fin. Here's the ventral fin again. Here's the pectoral fin. I still haven't shown you that I've got the head. This is a swimming crab here, and here is the end of the fin, and here's the tail. This is showing the shape of the lateral line. And eventually I got one shot of the head showing a single barbel. So when you put all of those together, there was no doubt that the record could be accepted, that it was a tadpole fish. And then quite a few people began to, we all saw it regularly for a while. I haven't seen it during 2020, but it was always in the back of one crevice in Newquay for, as I say, for about 2 or 3 seasons. Also in Newquay, this is the greater pipefish. They look like seahorses because they're related to seahorses. Look at the snout, and the coloring tells you the identification. A few odd pictures then of triggerfish in Newquay, not in 2020, but somebody did see one in 2020, but I didn't. But there were 4 or 5 of them, was it 2019? Near the pier in Newquay regularly are baby gurnard, and this and the next shot are the same species. So one can have a go at identifying them when you have a spot like that and when you have the blue margin on this fin here. And you can see that the photograph doesn't have to be fully in focus. This is my regret of the year. I haven't been diving because of COVID, but my last dive was on the 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, with one of the speakers tonight, Joe Fitzgibbon. And Joe found this. Now, I've seen smaller versions, but this one was a fully about 30 centimeters in size, a very large blob of a fish, a lump sucker. And that was my picture of it, straight on, head on picture. And that is my last picture, and I'm happy to share those with anybody who needs them. And I now have to see how I pass back stop sharing. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, Tony, it's over to you.
I think it's over to Maja, actually.
Yeah, it is over to me. So,
how do I?
Evening, everyone.
Maja can share herself.
Don't worry, I will share it. So all good.
Hopefully, you won't be sharing your background, sort of making everybody envious of your numerous trips to Galapagos and things.
Fiona, who's here, was there, so she should be aware. Right. So good evening, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you about cowries and nudibranchs. Probably for those who know me, know that I'm a keen spotter of small things, and I really love trying to discover as many nudibranchs as possible in Ireland. And I'm always happy to show them to people as well. But just before we go to nudibranchs, we'll talk a little bit about cowries, which are quite often overlooked in Ireland, but they are still very, very interesting. So around cowries, we have in Ireland two types of cowries. There are two different species. So we have spotted cowrie and we have an Arctic cowrie. They are very, very small. The biggest they can reach is around 1 centimeter, so they're quite hard to spot. But since everything is magnified underwater, with a little bit of patience, you can easily find them and spot them. So we also have a type of false cowrie, which is very pretty, called Simnia patula. And they are more common than you think. It's just hard to spot, and they do hide well and they blend in well into their environment. But just a little bit first about the cowries. So this is the classic anatomy of the cowrie, and you can see that it has a hard shell. In Ireland, that's mostly slightly pink or white, and then there is a mantle and the foot. And this is how you can easily identify the based on. And then they have a siphon tentacles here and the eye that you can see, the black tiny spot is the eye. So that just briefly externally, that will help you. Now, once you found your cowrie, how do you basically identify them? So the main thing to know about cowries is that they are very, very nocturnal. And that doesn't mean you can't spot them on the day dives. They will just be out and about on the darker dives. So that will help a lot. So there's no point just taking a picture of a shell, because you won't be able to identify them. Once they're out and about and fully exposed, that's when it's worth taking a picture. So in a darker dive, under a ledge or in a dark cave or in the swim through, you should be able to see them out and about and open. So what's the best way to take the picture for identification purposes? As you can see here, you can clearly see the picture of the cowrie and you can see the shell. And you can see that here it's fully exposed tentacles. You can even see the eyes and you can see the mantle and the foot. And basically, as you can see, no spots. Nothing. So you can't even see one spot. So you can clearly see that that is a picture of an Arctic cowrie. Then we also have a spotted one. So what's also important is, if you can, that you do take the picture, kind of a wide angle picture, slightly in their habitat. As Tony explained previously, if you can, of course, it's good to see the environment that they're in, and that will give more information about the cowrie itself. So it will give us a lot of information to try to get from the picture. So the next picture that you should try to do is try to take a closer picture of the cowrie. So, and the most important thing is that the mantle is fully visible. So, for example, this is a lovely picture. Doesn't tell us which species it is. We can't identify them, right? But if you look at the next picture here, you can see clearly the cowrie, and you can see these white spots. So that is a spotted cowrie. So with these two, the other two, we can't say what they are, but this one is fully exposed and clearly visible. You can see the eye, you can see the mantle, you can see the foot. So those are the type of pictures that will help you and try to identify the cowrie and the two species that we have. So one picture, wide angle, closer picture if you can. And if at all possible, what you could try to do, try to take a picture of the cowrie showing scale in the environment. So that means, now, if you can see this picture of the cowrie, this is a slightly different cowrie, and that you can see the mantle is different and the leg is different. So there you go, that's an Arctic cowrie here. And you can see it's right next to jewel anemone, so it gives us the idea of the size of this cowrie. So this one is approximately one of the bigger ones, the size of the jewel anemone. And it gives us a lot of ideas, and it will give us a lot of other information. It will give us what environment it is in, the size, what it's currently doing, you know, whether it's feeding or not feeding. Now, the pulse cowries, which took me a while to discover in Ireland, but they are everywhere. Especially easy to discover in the West Coast because of the clearer water, or in the south of Ireland. So basically what you would do, again, you would try to take a picture of the environment that it's in. You can see clearly dead man's fingers. And I don't know if you can spot the cowrie. It's hiding clearly in there, in the among the dead man's fingers, in the tentacles, and you can see there. If we get closer, that is the cowrie, that it's there. If you wanted to take even a better picture, you could gently touch the polyps of the dead man's finger, and not fully, but just gently, and you can expose the cowrie fully. So the dead man's fingers will retract the polyps. You won't hurt it, you won't harm it. They do that naturally, continuously, and you can expose it. But of course, don't fully touch it. Just gentle tap, and it will retract the tentacles. And you can see the eye, and you can see it clearly. If at all possible, look around, there might be eggs of the cowrie there. Of the Simnia patula, and that's basically its eggs, and it's laying the eggs. Right, on to the next topic, which is the nudibranch. So nudibranchs, we have a lot of species. There are well over 100 species of nudibranchs in Ireland, and they are continuously being discovered. Every day they're discovered, I mean, every day I almost say, every year they're discovering new species. Bernard Picton is discovering, has a species named after him, and it was discovered in Ireland. What is important to know about them is how to find them and how to identify them. So first, again, they're more common than you think, and they can be mostly found where they live, on their food source, on hydroids. Look for eggs that are white and can be easily found. And also, what's important to know is, for the sea search purposes, we're not looking for brilliant pictures. We're not looking for pictures that are have any that you would enter it into a photo competition. But if you have a great messy picture, as long as the nudibranch is sharp and you can clearly see it, perfect. So just a little bit about nudibranch's anatomy. So we have two types of nudibranchs, two groups, the main ones. We have eolid nudibranchs, and which have cerata, and we have rhinophores, and we have the tentacles and the foot. So that is one type, and you can, those that have these cerata, you can identify them mostly by the cerata or on their colorings. And we have dorid nudibranchs, which are the flatter ones, which you can identify them by their gills mostly, or by their coloration of their mantle, not so much by their rhinophores. So those are the two types that we have, and quite commonly you can find them in Ireland. Now, this is a very nice picture of a nudibranch, and it's perfectly sharp, but it's not so useful for identification purposes, as you can see. While you can clearly identify the species, you can't tell. So that's recently renamed Mansella pedata by Bernard Picton. You can't tell much about it. You can't tell the size, what it's doing, anything. So what you want is the type of pictures that look very, very messy, but are really useful for identification purposes. So this picture is telling us much, much more than the previous picture, but has no photographic value, but for sea search, it's excellent. So you can clearly see the 3 nudibranchs, and they are basically within the eggs of the bigger nudibranchs, because all the 3 that are here are predating them. And while they're predating and eating the bigger eggs, they're also creating their own red egg ribbons within this one. So that's very useful. And the more you can photograph together on one picture, the better it is. For example, it even helps with these species. This is Nudibranchus ferrani. You can see, okay, it's very messy, but you can clearly see that the different color variations of the nudibranchs that you can find of these species. So that really helps for any recording purposes. Right. So onto this one. If you can record behavior, and they're quite often easier to spot because of the white egg ribbons, perfect, because we can see the background clearly, and we can see the nudibranch, and we can see what it's currently doing. It's basically laying the eggs or creating an egg ribbon. So that's very handy. The next picture is a picture that I actually took on in a Dublin dive site, on the Sea Search Record dive site. And that picture confused me, and I wasn't sure what kind of picture this actually was, because these nudibranchs mostly are, so this is a standard coloration of the nudibranch, but this one was blue. So I took a picture, and I still wasn't sure which one it is, and I actually shared it with a Facebook group, North Atlantic Nudibranchs, and they actually confirmed that none of the books said this was blue. It wasn't supposed to be blue, but yet there were a few in the world, in Norway, that were recorded that were also blue. So this was basically the same species as this one, just it came in unusual color. So again, very useful for recording purposes and sharing them with the wider community, so we can all learn more about them. Another thing which is very important is to try to spot unusual behavior or something that looks funny with this nudibranch. So this nudibranch is a very pretty nudibranch, but if you see there's something wrong with it, it's missing its serrata, it doesn't have them. So what happened with this nudibranch is, due to the stressful environment and the external stress it experienced, it actually dropped its serrata. It wasn't predated, it actually dropped them. And either didn't have enough food, or there were environmental factors that caused it to drop them. So this nudibranch that you can see is quite a large one. It normally looks like this. But if you can see on the top picture, it literally dropped all the serrata. Again, a very usual behavior. It's not recorded often, but if you can spot it, you know, if you look at the nudibranch, this looks funny, this shouldn't be like this, you can take a picture of its environment, and that will be very useful for recording purposes. So that's Antiopelia cristata, the nudibranch. Now, I was mentioning earlier that it's sometimes very handy to see whether you can record and you can take a picture. And here is an example of one picture. It's not a particularly good or good quality picture. It's taken with a wide angle camera on an evening dive in Dublin, but it has no photographic value, but it's excellent for identification purposes. So I don't know if you can see the nudibranch clearly. So there's the nudibranch, and if you can see the size of it, probably this was around 20 centimeters. And you can see it's the size of 2 dead man's fingers. And you can also see it's actually eating another dead man's finger. It literally chomped on it and had it in the mouth when I was taking the picture. So again, very handy to if you can manage to record everything in one picture. If not, take 3, 4, 5 photographs. But if you can show the scale, that's actually quite useful in one photograph. And again, as you see, it's very messy. I mean, no one would enter this picture into any competitions or anything, but perfect for research purposes. The next one, again, if you can see, there is no photographic value, but again, very useful for sea search purposes. You can see fully the environment. So there's the nudibranch. You can approximately guess the size of it. It's max 1 centimeter approximately, based on the jewel anemone that's next to it. That's how big they get. And you can clearly see it's on that man's finger, and it's actually feeding on that man's finger. So this picture will tell you environment that it's in, the size of it, and based on the blue spots, you can clearly record the species and you can tell what they are. So that in the short, that was my presentation about the nudibranchs and how to take pictures of them. So keep in mind, if you have those massive pictures, you expose the whole background. You can record a lot of the hydroids, everything, such pictures that are perfect for identification purposes. They don't need to be excellent, just that you can see the quality and identify the nudibranch. That's enough. But don't think about that you need to master everything at first. Okay. Also, sorry, I'll just show you this as well. If you need to identify nudibranchs, so this is a good site that I use. It's called Scottish Nudibranch. If you Google that, it's a website that is maintained by Jim Anderson, one of the nudibranch enthusiasts. And this is actually mostly recorded in Scotland. He also has an Irish page, but Scottish and Irish nudibranchs are very, very similar. And you can find the species to identify them. So once you can see a different colorations and variations of the pictures. So you can try to identify them yourself based on this already. So it's very handy on all the website. Again, they will show eggs, different variations. So this is the Doris, and you can see one species, how many different colors it can have. So that's just Dotos, for example, just a few examples. And you can see none of these pictures are really, really good quality, just as long as you can see the nudibranch clearly of what it is. Okay. So, okay, I'll say thank you very much and hand over to Joe, I believe.
Well done, Maja.
Hi guys, Tony, do you want me to go ahead or do people want a quick break?
You must be on a call.
Happy to crack on.
We've been here nearly an hour. I'm just wondering whether we should take a 5-minute break.
I think we're all enthusiastic, Joe. We can go ahead.
Do you want to go straight ahead? Okay. Now. Let me just go right up here. So I first started taking a camera underwater because I was fed up coming back from a dive and asking my more knowledgeable friends, what was that thingamajig? And most of the photographs that you will see in the next few minutes were taken with one or other of these two compact cameras, very reasonably priced. Like John said, the Olympus is good to 15 meters. underwater without a housing, and the Nikon will go to 30 meters. The big difference between the two is that the Olympus will shoot in RAW and the Nikon only shoots in JPEG. But that said, you can still get some fantastic photographs with it. So I'm going to talk to you about sea anemones and how to photograph them and what to look for. Understanding a little bit about them always helps, I think, when it comes to taking the correct sort of picture. First of all, they come from the phylum Cnidaria, and they belong to the same family as coral, hydroids, and jellyfish. They look like pretty flowers, but they are actually weaponized animals. What they all have in common is stinging cells called nematocytes or nida or nidocytes, coming from the Greek word for nettle or sea nettle. And these are specialized capsules that discharge on stimulus, either physical touch or chemical, and they will entangle or stick into or poison or cut their prey. They have a very simple anatomy, no circulation. The tentacles are there to trap prey and to lead the prey into the mouth. Most unfortunate animals ever, because the mouth also acts as the anus. They have water within the body of the animal, and when they close their mouth, the water inside acts as a hydrostatic skeleton, and that allows the animal to change shape and get thinner or fatter or taller or shorter. Just like you can see in this dahlia anemone here, quite a tall example of that. When it comes to describing, we look for a number of features. The first is the mouth, which I've circled here in this anemone. And the next thing we consider is the disc. And then we look at the number and shape and pattern on the tentacles. But one very important aspect of anemone ID is the column. Now, this is a photograph of a column, but you can't really tell much about it. It is actually a very famous column in Germany. But looking at it from the top down, as we often look at our anemones, doesn't tell you much about it. So turning to the side of a column, you will find all sorts of detail and interesting information, which can be very helpful when it comes to an accurate ID. The columns and bases are what give some of the divisions in the family. We have the true sea anemones, which are individual animals attached to a hard surface. And we have over 1,000 of those. We have anemone-like burrowing anemones, which are individuals again, but they live in tubes, usually buried in soft sediment. And then we have the anemone-like encrusting anemone, which are colonial, which are attached to a common base. And I hope that becomes a little bit clearer now in a moment. Understanding something about symbiosis is also helpful in identification. The famous example, of course, is Nemo and his anemone, the anemone fish and the clownfish. In our waters, what we have is examples of symbiosis with the snake locks anemone. This is the snake locks in its usual, only sort of natural drab color. But once the symbiotic zooanthellae inhabit the snake locks, it gives us this beautiful color of greens and pinks. Another interesting symbiotic relationship is the spider crab, which commonly inhabits the snake locks anemone, but as Tony was pointing out recently in discussion, he hasn't seen any in snake locks anemones for quite a while, and since I've been looking, I haven't seen them either. What we do see is these little crabs on jewel anemones. That little goby, I think, is in the Mediterranean waters. We don't have it in Ireland. And then another example of symbiosis is the cloak anemone, so called because it will drape right over the hermit crab's shell as a cloak, and it has a symbiotic relationship with the hermit crab. I pinched this photograph from one Jim Greenfeld from Pinterest. I don't have any photos of my own. So in terms of the different types of anemone, I'm sure everyone has seen the plumose anemone. It's got this beautiful frilly, sort of flowery head, and it is on a very long, sometimes quite tall stalk or column. It comes in orange and white, and I don't think it needs any much further explanation than that. You'll all recognize that. The dahlia anemone, Zerticina felina, is one of our larger anemones with up to 160 short tentacles. It's I have actually sat down in front of my computer after a dive and started counting tentacles when I wasn't sure of ID. You can imagine if you're not going to do that in the middle of a dive sitting over a dahlia, or any other anemone, but when you have a photograph and you take it home, you can actually go into any software program and then start putting little dots on each tentacle as you count them. Here's another example of a dahlia which has filled itself with water and stood quite erect. It's got these little white verrucae, warts, on the column, and they secrete a sticky substance which accumulates little pebbles and little bits of shell on them as well. So that's quite a characteristic of this anemone, although not unique to this anemone. And the other feature about dahlias is that they have this amazing technicolor variety about them. In fact, when I'm often on a dive and I'm thinking of the All-Ireland football final, and I'm wondering, you know, which team colours we're going to see today. We see so many varieties. It's just fabulous. The elegant anemone is another favourite. The thing about this anemone is that it has a very wide base. The base you can see here is broader than the column. Let me see here. This is my little arrow. The base is much broader than the column. The column then goes up and fans out into a trumpet shape. It again has these little white verrucae on it, little spots on it, and it has sticky stuff which then again causes these little pebbles and things to stick onto it. The tentacles here are about 200 in number, and they're moderately long. I personally have looked but haven't seen these synclines or small pores. I don't know how you pronounce that word. By the way, who put a C in front of Nidarian? I don't know. Anyway, these small pores I've looked for and haven't found, but I'll keep looking and maybe somebody more knowledgeable can point them out to me. They come in various varieties. This is the miniata version, which is quite a common one that we see in UK. But there are also the Nivea, which are basically all white. And then we also have the Venusta, which have this beautiful orangey yellow disc with white tentacles. And then we have the most beautiful possibly of all our anemones, which is the Rosea variety. Again, you can see the white verrucae on the column opening up into it like a trumpet shape, and then these beautiful, elegant 200 or so tentacles, which are moderately long. And just for interest, this little animal, presented itself on one dive recently about 3, maybe even 2 months before Valentine's Day, and I kept it for the day in question because it was such a beautiful photograph. Straight out of camera, not liquefied in Photoshop or anything like that, just a beautiful moment in a dive. And then I had been reading on various websites about the 5th variety of Sargathia elegans, the Aurantiaca, and then I was out looking for it and kept looking for it, never found it. And then once I was drifting down the mid-channel in Newquay, not looking at much at all, and then suddenly came across this magnificent specimen. Magnificent just because it filled the full house of my hand, and I now had all 5 varieties of Sargathia elegans. I'll come back to that question of varieties and whether or not they are actually useful, but useful or not, they are absolutely gorgeous to look at. Imperial anemones are quite distinctive as well. They have these short, knobbly terminal knobs. There's about 150 of them, and they're arranged in circles. So you will find that each sort of row of knobbed tentacles in circles, called Capnia sanguina because of its blood-like color. But wouldn't you know it, we also get white ones and other colored ones. But these are quite distinctive once you see them. There's not much mistaking them. Here's a clock face anemone. I haven't seen too many of these. In fact, this might be the only one I've ever seen off the southwest coast of Connemara, I believe. And it's a clock face anemone because it has 12 tentacles, and they're counted as 12. And it has this very unusual concula, which is a small lobed projection in the mouth. The book or the website says that it's unique to this genus. So they are our true anemones. There might be a few more, of course, that I haven't covered there. But then we have an anemone like burrowing anemones. So these are not a sort of single lodged onto a hard surface, but rather buried under soft sediment. Cheiranthus lloydii here, which can be quite big and elegant, and sometimes you take a second glance to make sure that it's not a firework anemone. The tentacles project above the sand, everything else is underneath the sand. They can be brown or green or white, and they can also be banded. So you'll see quite a few varieties of that as well. Our other burrowing anemone is our famous firework anemone, Pericanthus multiplicatus. This is rare. We find it in the Kenmare River and in Kilkieran Bay, and then in a couple of places in Scotland. These are, again, absolutely gorgeous. You can see here, this is all white tentacles with the darker tentacles in the middle. This animal can be up to 1 meter long underground. Here's another example of it. And then sometimes the tentacles are banded in this way. So they're all firework anemones. The encrusted anemones, this is a white cluster anemone. It was taken at about 17 meters under in Ross Row on the wreck out there. And the thing about the encrusting anemones is that if you follow their stem, so you follow the column down, and you'll find that they share a common base. So they're colonial, they're not individuals. Their tentacles are in 2 distinct rings. The first one here, where all the tentacles are splaying outwards, and the second row where all the tentacles are going straight up into the air. So here was me being all fancy and artistic, trying to get a lovely shot of the animal itself. Tony, who I've pinched this picture from him, I believe, took this more useful shot because it shows you more clearly that they are sort of clumped together and that they share a common base. So for example, here you see these 2 columns coming into one. So that's the advantage, as Maja was saying there earlier, to take a wider angle shot of the animal in question before moving in to take your closer shot. Then we have our knobbed anemones, the Coronactus viridis, the jewel anemone, which is, I think if it's not the only one, it might be just one of 2 varieties of knobbed anemones that we have in Irish waters. Somebody can correct me on that. Nice smooth column with up to 100 tentacles, and they all have this characteristic knob at the end of each tentacle. You'll have seen them. There are plenty of different varieties, lots of different colors. And would you believe all of these photographs were taken on the same dive, at the same dive site in Newquay in County Clare. Now, when we run into situations where we're not sure about what we're looking at, there's this very useful group, the Northeast Atlantic Cnidaria group. And when you come across, say, something like this, I'd never seen one of these before. This again was from Newquay. It was surrounded on all sides by Sargathia. And I just said, is that a baby Sargathia or what is it? I had no idea. It was hidden deep in a crevice. So I wasn't able to get in and give it a little stroke and see what its column looked like. So that's the only photograph that I could get. And so what I did was I just went into the Any Atlantic Cnidaria Facebook group. I posted it up. I displayed my ignorance. What could this be? Is it juvenile Sargathia? But then within very short time, you get these world experts who will very, very helpfully come back and say, no, it's not Sargathia, and in this case, it's an Anthoplura species. Let me bring you back to this image I showed you earlier on. I had never seen anything like this, and I started wondering, is this actually a dahlia, or is it an elegant, a Sargathia elegans? And I put up a picture, and we had a little discussion going on, and some were saying it's dahlia, some were saying Sargathia elegans, wasn't quite sure. Of course, At the time, I didn't realize how important it would be to have the column to look at. And if we had the column, it might have been much easier to give an idea. But the consensus anyway was that this is actually Sargathia elegans, but it doesn't fit any of the 5 species, or sorry, the 5 varieties already described. So Bernard was saying he's not convinced that there is any usefulness in describing the varieties, because you then get these sort of varieties thrown in on top, which sort of break all the rules. Unless maybe I could put my name onto this. Here's another interesting Sargathia. I got very excited when I saw this, because the last time I saw anything like this was in my biology book in school, and I thought, this is mitosis. This is one animal becoming 2. And I was wondering whether we were getting a sort of an asexual reproduction by laceration, or what was it? And again, very helpful. We were able to put this up on the Facebook page and discuss it. And very knowledgeable people were able to say, no, this actually is a Siamese, a conjoined twin. And he had seen specimens like it before, and had observed them in the lab, and assured me that this was not going to become 2 animals, but just was one animal, but in 2 parts, if you like, conjoined. So that's very interesting to be able to speak to experts when we don't know what's happening. And then another very useful website is the Marine Life Information Network. You've got a list of species that you can look up from A to Z. And once you go in there, you can get descriptions, very good descriptions of all of the different species. So for example, I went in to look up Anthoplurus, and then I found out, oh yeah, it likes to live in crevices, it's hard to reach. And so, well, you know, that's exactly where I found it. So it's very helpful to get that sort of feedback on it. So obviously I haven't covered every possible anemone, but I think the important thing is to be able to, when you're taking a photograph of the animal, is to look for the mouth, the disc, the tentacles, and don't forget the column. Thank you. Tony, I'll pass back to you. Or is it to Martin?
I think it's Martin up next, telling us what we've been doing wrong in terms of taking photographs.
No, I haven't. Glad to see so many faces on the watching the. I can't see a lot of faces with names that I'm familiar with, and I'm sure you've learned a lot, like I have. One of the big drawbacks I have is remembering a name of something. So it's great to have Joe and Tony on a dive site when you're looking for something. I don't too often get to be on a dive site with Maja. So it's generally John, Tony, and myself that frequent Nuki often enough. I'm just sharing my screen now. Sure. Okay. So I was asked to talk about photography techniques. You can all see my screen there, can you? Yeah. So I'm Martin Kiely. I'm with the Atlantic Dive Club. I've been diving 30 years now, and I take photos above and below the water. And in this little half an hour, I'll try and give you a little hand on how I think you can best improve your pictures, particularly for the sea search thing. But that's not to say that you can't take a picture for aesthetic reasons and hang it on the wall. Hopefully you'll have a better idea of how to take a picture at the end of this. So we'll look at macro stuff, nudibranches, we'll look at wide angle, macro again, and what the subject might be living on. But what I first want to talk about, what will aid you most on a dive and how to take a picture, is having proper buoyancy and proper trim. And it'll make you more appealing to a buddy as well if you have proper trim. There's nothing worse than having someone on the dive on the 10 to 4 position, 10 to 5 position, and they're kicking up all around them. So if you have proper trim, you'll make an excellent dive site. And I regularly dive at Odd when I'm not doing the sea search stuff or on Nuki, and Odd is a great spotter for me. and she's great technique, and often I'd use her light to aid me taking pictures, particularly when I wasn't using strobes. I'd often get all to accompany me with her light, and she'd have the same light as myself, so I'd have the same temperature working on the torches. So Joe, our previous speaker, this is Joe, and you can see he's not lying. That's the camera he generally takes with him underwater, and that's his light source, which is attached to his arm. He also has a spotter torch on his housing, or on his tray, I should say. So again, you can see with Joe, proper trim will go way more than, you know, to help you take a picture. So I suppose enough said on that. So today we're going to look at, like I said, the nudibranches and what settings maybe you might be best used underwater. Generally for the macro stuff, for people that are not familiar, and that's why you should be familiar with your camera. And like Joe said, if you can get a camera, even if it's compact like this Canon, that does manual settings, it will help you so much in take the pictures, because for the macro stuff, you want to be taking your f-stop would want to be at least f14 up to f22. And now the disadvantage of that is the bigger the number, the smaller the hole in your camera, the less light that's getting in. So you need plenty of light for something like that. But I'll go through that in a second and show you maybe techniques on how to improve. This is a little example. If you just have your camera and a torch, and often and the picture I showed previously with Joe, he uses a torch, and generally your torch is on your left hand, because all the camera buttons tend to be designed for right-handed people. So your shutter button is on your right-hand side. So I would generally have the torch on my left-hand side when I'm taking a picture. And what you're looking for as well with your picture is that your cone of light is on the subject. And because in Ireland, there's a lot of tuberty in the water, a lot of backscatter, or a lot of, I suppose what attracts fish to Ireland is there's a lot of plankton and stuff in the water. But the disadvantage of that is if you're taking a picture and your light source shines through that backscatter, you can see all the particles in water. You don't tend to see it on video, but it is more obvious in a picture. So by having your light source away and shining in on your subject from the left or right will make this a lot easier. So again, this was taken with a compact picture, and I used a light source, and I use that light source at the 12 o'clock position. I tend to talk in clock positions. With my hand, the 10-2, the 12 o'clock, and the 10 past are 10 past is the easiest for me. If I was taking a picture and I needed 2 torches, that's where I'd come in handy, bringing in the second torch. And that's when I was taking pictures without strobes. So again, there's your compact camera. You can keep it at the 10-2 position, and have, if you can hold the torch, start from behind the camera, and if you need to, you can more bring it forward and focus in on the camera, or focus in on the subject, I should say. Again, if you can get it to the right side, same position. So again, you're looking at your subject here, and you want to take a picture straight on. It's best that you have your light source out from the camera, and this can be your torch or it can be a strobe, depending on what you want to do. And you want that cone of light just hitting the edge of your subject. So then there's no particles being picked up by the camera in this side, so you have everything lit up on the subject, and the view of the camera is probably working on that area, depending on the lens you're on in the camera. So it makes for an ideal picture then. This is a former buddy of mine, and you can see him here using his compact, taking a picture. No light source within the camera, and this is the type of subject you can get. So it isn't to say that you can't get a picture of a subject without a light, but a light does so much more to a picture. So this is Devonshire cup coral. Again, me using a torch and holding my torch on my left hand, as you can see the Devonshire, I'm shining the torch. And it's when you have a macro lens on or you're shooting in macro, you can get the torch quite near your subject actually, without it actually being in the picture. Again, another Devonshire, fabulous pictures to take of. But again, this is just one light source, a torch. So you could take this with your compact camera and a torch. And these light up magnificently. It's the nearer you get the light and the more light you can get at it, and the better picture you get. Again, subject with a torch. Now, this picture was taken with natural light, so sometimes the subjects are bigger that you're taking, and you can just use the natural light that you have above you. It's actually a picture of Niall Stapleton in the background for anyone that's interested. And this is Dusty taken in Doolin. So, if people have strobes, and you might have 2 strobes, I would suggest that if you're thinking of getting a strobe, invest in the best strobe you can get. And if it's one, just get one for the time being, and you can work on a single and work on one, and then later you can get your second one. When you're taking the picture, it's best that you have your, particularly a scene picture, and I'll show you a scene in a second. You see the way the strobes are positioned behind the dome of the camera, and that cone of light is going to come out. I'll go back to that again. That cone of light from this strobe, the strobe on the left, is going to go off that way, and the cone and the light on this is going to go off that way. So the column of water between the subject and the camera is not lit up. What you're lighting up is the subject. So here you have it again, using 2 light sources. You see your strobe when they fire, or your torch if you can get someone to hold a torch. It's this area, you just want to light up the subject. Another thing you need to know is the minimum distance that you can get with your camera. And I know with a camera, my macro lens, my 60mm macro lens, if I put my thumb and finger out apart, I know without even thinking about it, if I go that close to the subject with my lens, I'll have the camera, I'll have the subject in focus. So that minimizes as well the amount of water, the water column between you and the subject. So knowing that is quite important. Some lenses can get you as close, or some compacts can get you as close as 6 inches. There's another buddy of mine taking a picture, again in Newquay. This is Mike Ort. And you can see how close he is to the subject. There's a Nudibranch here. Mike has his torch, his spotted light, so he's seen a torch, and you can see how close he's getting. You can see the position of his strobes as well. At this stage, they're close to the camera, but facing slightly out. So he just wants the cone of the flash hitting the subject. For wide angle subjects, I'd go back to that position and have my strobes facing away from the subject or away from my camera. And I'm trying to light up a whole scene then. Again, I think most divers at this stage know that light disappears underwater. The deeper you go, the colors disappear. And that's the same with your torch. The further the subject is from your torch or your light source, the colors will dissipate as well at that distance. So bearing in mind where your positions is, you can see on the left hand side there, I'm quite near the reef. Fisheye lenses and wide angle lenses allow you to get quite close to a subject. Again, lighten up the whole subject. This time the subject being a body, but the principles are still the same. Having your light source and the cone of light just hitting what you want to. Here, the subject I wanted to light up was the eye. So having that cone of light just hitting that and nothing in between means there's very little backscatter. And what backscatter is there is probably from his hand knocking on the bottom. Again here, shooting up into the light. Again, I have no backscatter in the picture, and that's achieved by the position of the strobes and only lighting the cone of light hitting the subject, here being the anemones or the plume anemones. Here I'm using one light source coming in from the right. And sometimes I was on this dive, sometimes the subject comes too quick. I was actually taking a picture of the reef here when John Breen and Dr. Tom kept telling me there was something behind me. And I thought he was suggesting that it was my rag that was leaking, which is not uncommon, I have to say. But since George Lambeth fixed my rags, I can't have that problem anymore. But what was behind me was these cormorants were coming fishing, and they were behind me for a while. I don't know, was it the bubbles were attracting them? But again, having a setting in your camera that you might, when a subject appears, that you might be ready for, having something in your camera like an f8 and your shutter speed at 1/250, 1 over 125th of a second will generally give you an idea of what you want. And here, I was quite happy with when I was shooting up into the reef here. I had balance for this scene, unknowing that in a couple of minutes the birds were going to come. So here I'd fired off a strobe or two, but I caught these birds when the strobe hadn't fired. So that's kind of in natural light. And here I'll show you, Joe touched on these a while ago, plume anemones, which they're full of, and how do you take a picture of them? So this is head on, or straight at the picture. You can get close in a macro picture. So the first one is a wide angle, or staying further back from the subject. And here you actually have the subject feeding. So this can be an interesting subject for the wall. Plus it can tell you a lot more, as Joe was telling you earlier, about the type of anemone that you're looking at. And sometimes you might want, as Joe was saying, that might be one for the wall, or one to identify the subject. But this could be a picture later that you'd want to hang on the wall and go back to it again. Sorry, I'm a bit heavy-handed with my mouse. Yeah, so that might be an abstract picture that you might have for the wall. Again, how would I take a picture like this? The settings on there's a lot of light in the background, so I've opened up the aperture in the camera. That means I'm not letting a lot of light in. The effect that does to the picture is that what I'm focused on is very sharp, but everything behind it starts to become blurred. So I might have taken this at f4, which is a big hole in your camera, but it allows extra light into the background. The more light that gets in, you can see your background. Now, there's other ways that you can utilize that to your advantage. Whereas here, I might want to isolate a subject again. But here, if I use a big number on my camera, like f22, it's reducing the amount of light in to the camera. And what becomes sharp then is what the light source is hitting and makes your background black. This is actually a day dive for, a similar dive to the other pictures there. Sorry. So again, these were more or less taken at the same area. And this is on a bit of kelp. And how you're doing that, and like this might be, you can identify the subject by what it's feeding on probably, and the tentacle out of the curly. But achieving that is with your aperture. The less light that gets into the camera, the darker your background becomes. Here I actually took this picture last week, researching for this. I was in Newquay taking a few pictures, and you have the name is gone for me. Well, anyway, what's interesting in this picture is the eggs underneath the spined scorpion fish. Yeah, long-tail spined scorpion fish, I think. And again, showing one of the anemones Joe taken. Again, if you want a whole subject in macro in focus, you'd want to be shooting at f28. If you're looking at the front, the minimum aperture you should be shooting for macro stuff, be it a nudibranch or an anemone, is you want to be starting at f8 to f10. and working up to f22. For wide angle stuff and using your wide angle lens, you might start at f4 and work up to f8 and not need to go any further than that because the subject is close to you and you're trying to isolate something at the back. But trying to get the whole length of a nudibranch in focus, you're going to be up to from f14 up. What I liked about this picture was that the fish decided to let me know that he knew who I was. John Breen said he was buttering me up, and that's a hint to the type of fish that we're looking at. And here, again, this is why I love diving in Nuki, a bit like Joe. I took this thinking of the same day, Joe. Kind of a heart shape I saw here on the reef. But again, when you're shooting at a reef, you're trying to balance for the background, and it's probably blown out a little bit. But shooting at f8, having two strobes hitting the reef, and my strobes are angled away from myself, pull behind my camera, and I'll pull up my camera in a second and maybe go through camera settings or camera light positions with the camera. Yeah, so if I stop sharing my screen, probably. Stop sharing. I hope you can all see me there. So if this is my camera, now Aude is right-handed, so she tends to keep her housing. If this was my camera, I'd have this handle on this side, which would allow me to hold a strobe or my light source here. And I then have access to my shutter button, knowing where my focus button is and knowing where my shutter release button is. I can then, if it's a macro subject like a nudibranch, I can move this torch from any position, from the 10 pass to the 10-2 position. I can get it as close or further back. So depending on if I'm if I have the manual option on my camera, which I do with this, so if it's a nudibranch, I can go up to f28 and I can get this light source quite close to my subject. Or I can have my torch or my strobe positioned either in that position over or behind. If I'm using strobes, I think if most people have something rigged like this, I don't think they need any lessons from me on how to use it. So, but basically, with a macro lens, I have a macro dome here. My strobes are behind, but often it's best to have them in slightly up and behind. And why I say slightly up is you want it to look more natural with a shadow falling on the subject to create a 3D effect on your picture. There's nothing worse than a two-dimensional picture. And that's where the light is flat or something is parallel to your camera. If that was my nudibranch. Yeah, and you take it, it can be quite a flat two-dimensional. It's often nicer if the subject is at an angle to you or moving towards the camera. Yeah, and then have my strobes in that position. The advantage of having the spotter light here is these spotter lights, which I've got from Anchor Light in Donegal, Dive and Deck. When you fire your strobe, this spotter light will actually go off. Once the strobes start to fire, this goes off. When the strobes are finished their job, the spotter light comes back on, so you're not going to lose your subject. Yeah, but again, I think if we're talking about a rig like this, I think most people would know how to use it. Yeah, I found the compact cameras, or like Joe said, I've often put one of these. I used to have the Olympus one in my pocket regularly, and it was great to take out because the macro zoom on these is fantastic, and you have a super zoom on them. You can get really close to your subject. Quite easy to light up, inexpensive, from €300. You'd probably have a dive torch anyway, and that's how I got into using the torch. flooded a strobe one day, and rather than end the dive there and then, I decided to use my strobe, and that's, after time, you will master using just one light source. So really, if anyone has any questions, I don't know, did the lads ask anything there? I think it'll be easier to answer a few questions. I think that's it, Tony.
Thanks very much, Martin. I don't know that we have a hell of a lot of questions. I was expecting more.
Maybe if people want to ask now or type it in there.
Yeah.
I mean, you might need to know how to take a picture or two, would you?
I think the first big question we got was what kind of camera gear, and I think we've been sort of answering that as we went along.
Yeah, I think even Joe and John showed as well, and I'm not sure what Maja camera was using, but the compacts are brilliant. The Olympus ones that are waterproof again are even better. The only thing is, if you are bringing it as a second camera in your pocket, make sure you keep to the depth restrictions. I brought mine deeper than it should have gone, and when it came up, it had imploded. So know your depth of your camera. There's no fear of Nuki, but if you're planning a dive in Kilkee or Quilty or somewhere.
May I comment to Martin?
Yeah.
I found that with the Olympus, that the buttons, my fingers can't really handle them underwater, whereas it's much easier with
when you have the housing.
When I have the housing. And the other thing is that I sort of feel that even if it floods, the camera is going to be fine anyway, because it's a 15-meter safe inside. So I've had one or two minor floodings where I've had bits of dirt on the O-ring around the housing. And I often feel, I haven't actually done it, that if it happened in a vital situation, I would just whip out the camera and take the photographs.
Yeah. Yeah, the advantage of the compact is like taking the big rig that I have, or the SLRs, and sometimes you're not welcome on a boat. When you hand it into the boat, people don't know what to do with it, or are afraid to handle it, or they reckon you're taking up much space. And then you have your bucket in the boat, and people give out to you because you don't want anyone else putting stuff in your bucket. So you can become a pain in some sources. So having just a compact is a lot easier to maneuver with. You can clip it to your dive gear as you're diving. They're a lot easier to go around with.
And that tadpole fish that I photographed wouldn't have been photographed by your big fancy photograph.
Yeah,
it would have got it under the ledge.
Yeah, I wouldn't have got it under the ledge. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so that would be my rig, Martin. That's just, it's currently in pieces, and two such flashes.
Yeah, strobes are the same as my own.
Yeah, strobes that I'll be using.
But I think most people here, if you need to know how to take a picture, you're probably starting off with your compact and maybe thinking of working up to it. Yeah, but the principles are still the same, where your light is and what you're lighting up.
And compact's going to take great picture. Just look at what Mike Orth has been taking for years.
Yeah.
And Joe.
And Joe, yeah,
And
Joe is amazing, yeah. I'm still envious of a lot of his macro shots.
Yeah. Martin, there was a question about how much buoyancy rings do you use for your wide angle?
Well, for the wide angle one, you don't need to. There's a lot of air within the dome itself. But for the macro, I would need, I have some floats. They're kind of, what do we call them? Actually, before I bought them, I was buying, I went off to a hardware DIY store and I bought some insulating foam and stuck them on, and they actually lasted on my rigs. I then went off and bought something like this. People can see it, but I found these less maneuverable than the ones I actually have on the camera at the minute. You could get something this small, but again, having your camera as well neutrally buoyant is very important, because if you drop your camera, it's nice to know that it's just going to sit there in front of you. There's nothing worse if your camera's buoyant, it's going to take off, and if it's, if it's heavy, it's going to sink. So depending on the time of the dive that you're on, you might be able to go down and get it again. So having your camera neutral point is quite helpful. Yeah, and practicing that, you could practice that in a swimming pool, keeping your buoyancy right. Anything else? I have interruptions going all around me here.
Martin, are you using wet lenses with the compact?
Actually, yes, I meant to say that. So with the macro, I would do that and attach an ion to the camera afterwards. Yeah, the wet lenses are brilliant. They give you a good wide field of view. The thing is, you have to put them on once you're on the dive, because it allows that airspace to be gone by the time. But it's easy to take them off and put them on. I have a little clamp that I can stick this to on the camera as well.
Do you have any trick for doing up and overs with the wide angle on that? Because what I've found is you get a meniscus because the water drains out as you go halfway up.
Okay.
Have you any trick for stopping it? Like I've been toying with the idea of elastic bands, but there's not been. I don't know. You seem to be getting in the water. We're not allowed in the water up here yet.
Yeah.
So, practice.
No, I haven't had that problem. I'll come back to you on it.
Okay.
It should be okay if you burp it underwater.
Yeah, once you the water gone and clear, it should be fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, but when you come to the surface, if you're trying to do an up and over, so you're trying to get above and
half
below,
and half.
then the water starts draining down.
Yeah.
Oh, look, that's going to drive you mad now, because with those little wide-angle lenses in the compacts, it just won't work.
Okay, fair enough.
You're going to need a really good, proper wide-angle lens and a proper camera for that, because yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Or else be very quick.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking of elastic bands just to cover the drain holes.
Maybe. You can let us know how you get on with it, man.
I will. I've tried a few. I would have had a couple of nice photographs, except for a dirty great big meniscus just spoiling the picture, you know. So
I think to be able to get a good picture underwater, though, going back to it, you should be very familiar with your camera on land before you start trying to do something with it underwater. And if you're only going to take your picture and you only dive every month, and that's the only time you take your camera out, you're not, when you need to go and take the picture, you're not going to be as quick, and so often the subject will be gone. Or if your nudibranch is on something that's moving and you're trying to freeze it, it's good to be able to move your fingers without thinking about it, knowing where your aperture and your speed settings are on your camera. So practice on flowers at home in the garden, particularly for the small stuff. And the more familiar you are, the better. And it's a lot easier as well to do that with a dome or with your housing in the garden. You know, that's not too heavy to be carrying around the garden to practice with. That's what I would say to most people. You really need to get familiar with the camera that you have. What type of camera? There's no such thing as a bad camera nowadays. So I generally shoot Nikon, but you can see here I have a Canon compact. I was a great advocate of the Olympus. Some of the pictures I showed earlier were taken with the Olympus. So I think whatever camera you have is a good camera. Yeah. And not having the camera is the bad camera. Yeah. Anybody?
No.
Around?
I think we've blown people away. I think we've just confused people. I'm not sure. I certainly enjoyed the presentations from people. I certainly found them very useful. I hope everybody else did as well. I'd like to express my thanks again to everybody for putting all the effort into it.
Yeah, Tony, I've shared a PDF as well on the chat, so people can download it for Nudibranch identification, how to identify them. It's 3 pages PDF easily. You can keep it on your phone or in your computer, and that will help you identify it. There's no point going through me explaining about all the species and what you can see.
No, thank you very much for that, Maja. It's quite handy. As you say, you do start need to look up the species. I was going to make a very bad comment about Bernard renaming the species on a weekly basis, but
That's true. It's true. I agree.
So if they stop doing that, it would be good. So I'd like to express my thanks again to everybody for all their effort. And the video of this will be put up online shortly, in the next little while. And our next talk up is on I'm not even sure what our next talk is up. I'm bluffing now. Have a look on Sea Search Ireland, and I believe it's going to be Lynn on Fisheye on the 30th. Sorry, I'm waiting for my website to give me dates. So we have Lynn is going to start to do fish for us in the next while, and on the 24th, and then Dr. Schoenrock Rossiter is going to come on and talk to us about Calpares, which is a very interesting talk on the biodiversity and the kelp ecosystems in Ireland. And then we have other talks in April. So I hope people will join us for those. So yet again, thanks to everybody for attending. Thanks to our brilliant presenters, and we'll see you next time.